Sarah. So glad you are here. And go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone.
Thanks, Jamie. My name is Sarah Kit Farrell, and I am a therapist working in private practice, and I specialize in working with what I describe as the whole spectrum of disordered eating. So from clinical eating disorders to, you might say, subclinical disordered eating, to folks who are moving through the world, perhaps chronically dieting or feeling like there might be something wrong with their body. Even folks who may not have food or body image issues per se, but might be working with what you might call a nourishment barrier, right? Because there are so many ways that we get nourished. And that's at the crux of my work, is wanting people to really feel empowered to nourish themselves.
Awesome. Yeah. And Sarah's located in the Denver area, in Denver, Colorado. And one of the reasons I really wanted to have this conversation with her is because after watching one of her YouTube videos, which was essentially her project for, what is a capstone project?
Yep. So that was essentially my final thesis when I finished graduate school at Naropa University.
Okay.
Because our program was a little bit creative in some ways. Instead of typing up one big paper to turn in, it was like a 40-minute long TED talk. Mm-hmm. And for me, there was no question of what I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, and it was amazing, and that's why I wanted to bring Sarah on. I just met Sarah about a month ago, and we had a few conversations and clicked pretty much right off the bat. And just from her conversation about, or informing me on kind of how she works with clients, and then seeing that video, I just really resonated with so many of those things that you said in that project. So I really wanted to just chat with you essentially about that project, and some of the things that you brought up are that I think is so super important for people in recovery to hear, because I think people can get really trapped with this idea of what recovery looks like, or attaining full recovery, and along their journey hearing that just some things that might be a little bit harmful and get them stuck. So some of the things I wanted to chat with you about is a little more in depth of that, a few things that you chatted about there, specifically some black and white thinking and how that's harmful, how hopelessness plays into continuing letting the eating disorder thrive, and what recovery actually looks like versus what it does not look like. And then lastly, just to bring in the conversation about recovered clinicians. And I think it's super important to talk about. I'm a recovered clinician. I think it's something that shouldn't be stigmatized. I think it's really, really important for people to hear that, and hear that full recovery is possible. And so I'd like to chat on that as well.
It's hard for me to even pick where to start, because
I know.
Yeah. Everything you just mentioned is something I feel really passionate about. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where do you think would be good to dive in?
Yeah, so we'll just dive in. If you want to tell us a little bit. So I have a few questions here, and Sarah and I were chatting before this, and we're going to try to keep it to about 20 to 30 minutes. It might go longer just because, like you said, I love this conversation, but we can always continue it at a later date as well. So to start out, your capstone presentation was called Progress Within Pathology, a Spectrum Model of Eating Disorder Recovery. Can you explain that title a little bit?
Yes, Progress Within Pathology. So I have been, I think like so many of us, really interested in this question of what is recovery from an eating disorder, right? And do people in recovery use the word recovered, period? Or do they say, I am in recovery, sort of perpetually? And that was one piece that really had me thinking. Another piece was this idea of what happens when we de-pathologize suffering. And actually, this is sort of an aside, but a lot of this was sparked after listening to a Radiolab episode from many years ago. The episode is called The Problem with the Solution. The Problem with the Solution. And among other topics, it took a look at this really unique community in Europe that was treating folks with intense mental illness as though they were human beings, right? So as though they weren't a problem that needed to be fixed, but instead taking almost like a neurodiversity approach, like how can we support folks living in their suffering in a way that actually leads them to health, right? So with all of that and my own life experience, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, I thought, okay, how do I want to conceptualize recovery from an eating disorder? And so I began to imagine, right, I took this idea of black and white thinking, which we know is really potent fertilizer for the eating disorder itself, right? And I wanted to sort of like break it and create something that had no black and white, but was entirely shades of gray. So my idea for a spectrum model of eating disorder recovery has, pathology on one side and recovery on the other side, which are both just sort of conceptual, right? There's nothing concrete there. And we can imagine ourselves and our clients as moving along this spectrum, right? So, okay, that's one piece, but it's more complicated than that because eating disorders are biopsychosocial illnesses. So there's not just one measure of what recovery would look like. So I thought, okay, not only does it go from pathology to recovery, but it's filled with many different sliding pieces, right? You might see one of those pieces as, do I meet the DSM criteria, right? Okay, yes, I do, or no, I don't, or I'm moving toward meeting less of those criteria, right? But there are so many other ways in which we experience suffering from an eating disorder, from psychiatric distress to self-esteem, body dysmorphia, even something like fear of eating in public, which may or may not be something someone's experiencing, right? How can I see that that is yet another, I'm almost picturing an abacus, right? Like yet another bead that I might move slowly toward the ideal of recovery. So this breaks open the entire black and white discussion around, are you recovered or are you eating disordered, right? And there's a visual that I made that can go with this that perhaps we can get to folks.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's imperfect, right? It's just, and part of the reason that it's imperfect, and it will always be, is because for every single one of us, for every single person watching, we have our own unique pathology recovery spectrum scale. The measures are going to be different, and what the picture of health looks like is going to be different, depending on our own unique recovery scale. One of the things that I love about this idea is that, back to that question of, are you recovered or are you recovering? Is that this model accommodates both. And here's how I see it. I see it as a threshold, right? So you've got your pathology on one side and then shades of gray to recovery. And perhaps somewhere here, there is a threshold beyond which you are operating in the world as a recovered person. And you can still very realistically hold this idea that there are going to be times when I'm triggered, right? There are going to be times when I notice old voices coming back. Right now, you and I are filming this in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and it's a time in which everyone's nervous systems are sort of aware in a heightened way. And it would be a very natural time for people to experience, right, old urges, yearnings, voices. Because after all, those are voices that are erroneously or not trying to come in and protect us. So if I operate in this way where I say, well, I'm either recovered or I'm totally, sick, then having that voice pop up might be terrifying. It might lead me to believe, oh God, there's something wrong with me. Perhaps I'm not recovered. And that may lead to fear and hopelessness, which is another piece that you brought in here, which can be super dismantling and really doesn't support us in our healthy realities. So instead, thinking about it as a spectrum, oh, wow, good thing I'm past my threshold of recovery, right? Because now I have the strength to know that these arising voices, thoughts, urges aren't my demise. They're just me being a normal human being in a super stressful time. Therein, we find agency, we find hope, we find empowerment, right? Like, oh, look how strong I am. I'm so strong now that I can hold these voices and still be recovered.
There's so much in there, so much. We can talk for hours, and I'm jotting a little bit of some notes here because I'm going to ask some follow-up questions to so much that you've covered there. But a lot of, when you started talking about just this unique journey and how I really unique journey and also unique definition of what recovery is for someone. And I think that, how I describe it, I love the way you describe that metaphor you use. I like to describe it as kind of just a puzzle of, we have this puzzle, everyone's puzzle is different, and we're finding, well, what's the next puzzle piece? And, one of the puzzle pieces might be a quote unquote relapse, or use of behaviors that might have not been there for a week or a couple months or what have you, but that puzzle piece is just that. It's to put into that puzzle as a step along your journey to recovery, of understanding, well, why am I using that behavior? Because one thing, and I see, I have, clients all the time who say, well, I'm using these behaviors, or I'm not using these behaviors, or I haven't used them for this amount of time. And it's really, almost the eating disorder, or what they view as recovery, or doing recovery perfectly or right, really keeps them stuck, because it's so much more than behavior use. And that's something that, you in this project, that you mapped out. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, one of the pieces of research that I looked to in putting together this capstone presentation came out of Canada. It's a project called the Community Outreach Partnership Program, COOP. And this is a harm reduction, outpatient, community-based program for folks with eating disorders. What's remarkable about this research is that this program never made reduction of symptoms one of its goals. Right? So if you were taking part in this program, you were never going to sit down with somebody who was going to say, okay, how do we get a reduction in these behaviors, right? Instead, they focused on measures of hope. How do we instill a sense of hope, right? Measures of how do we make life more enjoyable, more bearable in the now? How do we help folks feel supported? And even though this wasn't necessarily conceptual, spoken outright, one of the ways I see all of this is, how do we help you feel like you're an okay human being? Because you are. And what's remarkable is that after a period of a few years, I believe, in this program, not only were measures for well-being increased, but those folks saw on average a decrease in eating disorder behaviors. Mm-hmm. So again, there's something about, if we fixate on perfection, on some kind of purity test, right? Well, how pure can I be in my recovery? It sets us up to feel like failures, But if we can emphasize these aspects of recovery, right, which may have nothing to do with the eating disorder, we can, in some backwards way, go back and alleviate the symptoms. What I always try to say to clients is like, if you start noticing that recovery needs to be perfect, that's not your recovery voice.
Mm-hmm.
That's your eating disorder voice.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, I love that. And that's, really understanding another part of recovery that has nothing to do with behaviors, but really understanding the voice, those parts of you, what part of me, what sounds like my eating disorder, what sounds like me, and starting to learn that, because just like you said, this black and white thinking, this perfectionism, that really sounds a lot more like the eating disorder.
Right, right. And of course, this doesn't mean that you and I are lax about the very real dangers of these behaviors. Certainly not. And the way that I see it, just as there is a threshold for recovery, there certainly is a threshold of, immediate life-sustaining intervention, right? A point beyond which, right, there may not even be the ability to, to hold complexity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we need to be nourished to think well. And so this really is about holding both. How do we hold that this is a serious issue and not set you up to feel like, you know what? I don't know if I can cuss on your podcast. You know, when you struggle, because, and here's the crucial, you will struggle.
Mm-hmm.
We all will. And this leads me to this other piece that feels like super foundational in my thinking, which is that we live in an eating disordered culture, right? And if that is the case, right, then recovery is the ideal we are all working toward,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought that up. Again, you have said so many things that I want to touch on, but this idea of, I ask my clients all the time, what does recovery look like to them? Because, sometimes they are told what recovery looks like, or they have this envision of what recovery looks like. And sometimes that might be, a certain weight or weight restored, and then given to them, or, that the absence of these behaviors, and really asking like our clients what they want for their recovery, what that looks like, what their relationship with food and body, what they want that to look like, and empowering them to know that is very possible, where you can have this relationship with your body that's fully trusting. And so just empowering them to know that that's a possibility, and that and exploring that with them.
Yes. Gosh, that's something that I feel really excited to talk about, even just personally. There was a time for me back in the day when I thought, great, I'm recovered because I no longer am using my behaviors that are listed in the DSM, right? And it's taken me, I think it's 12 years for me now since that point, that what I used to consider as my punctuation mark.
Right.
And now I really do consider it to be more of that threshold that we were talking about. Because in the 12 years that have passed, I have found so many new, abacus strings to like usher little beads sweetly along toward recovery, which I'm using air quotations because what that really means is, as the ACT folks would say, living a rich and meaningful life, right? Feeling whole, feeling happy. And with that nuance that I have gained, that, I'm still working on recovery, even though I've crossed my threshold, I really want folks to know that complexity allows me to feel the total freedom, the kind of freedom that folks in it imagine is never possible.
Mm-hmm.
I am telling you, it is possible. I am telling you, it is possible
Mm-hmm.
to do things you never thought you would do, to say, holy shit. I already said shit. I broke the shit seal, so I'm going to say it.
Yeah.
Holy shit. I love my body.
Mm-hmm.
And at times I'm not happy with it,
Mm-hmm.
right? All of that is there.
Mm-hmm. And that's something, just you describing that for yourself and how you feel in recovery. That's something for, people watching, people who are in recovery, or contemplating recovery to, kind of think about, or if they're at a place in their recovery where they say, well, my treatment team thinks I'm okay, and I'm not using behaviors, and yet I don't feel free. That's something to think of. Well, that's what we're building, that trust here of, for you, is this what recovery feels like? Because if not, then you might have a little bit to go. There might be a few more puzzle pieces there, and that's possible. And that's why it's great just chatting with you, Sarah, is to talk about this idea of full recovery and what that looks like, so people know it's possible. So people are hearing that it is possible. And as clinicians, many of us clinicians are, who work with eating disorders are, and I know there's a stat in there that you said in your video, but are recovered. And that's why we're doing this, because we know that it's great, it's possible, and we want to help people get there. And I think it's an
Yes.
important conversation to have. It's not something that should be stigmatized. It's not something to feel shame about, and that it's possible, and you can get there too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And another topic that, as I started imagining the spectrum, it sort of like blew open new worlds, for me. And one of these worlds that I think maybe needs a little bit of rocking is this world of the recovered clinician, right?
Mm-hmm.
The recovered helper.
Mm-hmm.
Because as long as we, you know, contain recovery in this little black and white thinking box, not only are we taking away from the possibility of future wounded healers in
Mm-hmm.
the world, um, which can be such a rich source of healing, but also we're preventing clinicians who have had their own struggles from um, being able to be human, right? For being able to be themselves humans who are still doing the dance,
Mm-hmm.
who are still doing the dance. So that's something else I feel really strongly about, and also really want to tip my hat to Carolyn Costin there, who of course is training eating disorder recovery coaches, but also who has done so much in our field for, taking away the stigma of saying, yes, I once had an eating disorder, and I am bringing healing.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. We're opening up so many conversations. I want to bring it back to that project, because one of the main things I really want to talk about is this black and white thinking, and this black and white thinking about what recovery looks like. So the path in recovery, and so before I keep talking, I'll just hand that over to you. Tell us about the calendar and the timeline that you have created, and what your takeaways were with that.
Oh, well, okay, so a little storytelling. I hope everyone's okay with that. As I have alluded to, I myself struggled with a pretty active eating disorder for about 12 years, from the age of like 12 to 24. And that it manifested in sort of different ways as a restrictive eating disorder, and then later on as something more akin to bulimia nervosa. But there was a time when I was in college and I was committed to this idea of recovery in theory. I really wanted it. And yet I couldn't get there, and I couldn't stop using these behaviors, right? And so it was very frustrating, as you can imagine, and as many of you who are watching know. I had finally decided, okay, I want to fight this thing, and yet I felt helpless. And this was back in 2000, the very early 2000s, pre-smartphones. And so I had like an old-fashioned calendar on my wall. And I don't remember the moment that it started, but somewhere along the line, I decided if I can make it through this day without using my behaviors, I will circle a heart around this date in my calendar. And there was something about that just gave me something to hold on to, right? And a year passed, and 2 years passed, and 3 years passed, and I saved all my old calendars, and I was putting up a new calendar in 2008, and I thought, holy shit, I have data. I've been recording my behaviors for 3 years. And so I sat down one night with graph paper and I began to graph my symptoms. Although I really should rephrase that and say my symptom. I was really only tracking one symptom, right? And so that harkens back to this recovery model, right? Where if for instance, if you're suffering from bulimia, purging is only one of many symptoms, of many facets of what this gemstone of being human is. So anyway, my father always told me, Sarah, use your powers for good and not evil. And I think about that sometimes because perfectionism is, and attention to detail, this sort of type A way of being in the world, can be thought of as something that's like, gosh, that's so part of the eating disorder. And certainly it can exacerbate an eating disorder, right? And research does show, right, that this sort of temperament can be a predisposition. But in that moment, I took all my weird perfectionism and like love of straight lines and rulers and color coordination, and I graphed out my whole purging symptoms for like 3 years, right? And then I went through all my planner and I wrote down like, oh, this is when Matt broke up with me, and this is when this happened, and this is when my dog died, because I wanted to see what was happening in my life. And then I sort of took a step back and looked at this graph, which is quite long. And I thought, oh my God, it really is getting smaller over time. Because you can see like, I've used my behaviors this much this week, then this much, then this much, then this much, then this much, then this much. And the other huge takeaway for me, Jamie, was that if I zoomed in on any page, it didn't look like it was going anywhere. Mm-hmm. If I zoomed in on one page, it was like, ugh, yep. Nothing is changing. I'm hopeless. Mm-hmm. I'm a lost cause. But because I was able to step back and look at over 3 years and know that that was only 3 years, right? I had been doing this for many years. Mm-hmm. I thought, oh my God, wow, it is changing slowly over time. Mm-hmm. So for me, this was the huge breakthrough.
Yeah, that's so great. And that's something I mean, that's such good insight. And that's something I tell clients all the time when they feel like they're not moving, and yet I am seeing them moving. With every conversation that we have, I'm seeing them moving, and it's hard for them to see. And I think one of the things, and I think this is one of Carolyn Costin's eight pieces of recovery, keys to recovery, and it's patience. And that's, yes, because in that grit to continue to keep going. So in those moments when you felt like I'm still using symptoms, but you're on that timeline and heading toward full recovery, to be able to keep putting one foot in front of the other, knowing that like, as long as you continue to do that, you're on your way.
You know what else it makes me think about? And I'm sure you've had this experience too, when you're sitting across from another human being who says, oh, I relapsed, right? We can take that single facet and say, oh, well, then I guess you messed up, right? Like, wow, I guess you're back at square one. But that sentence contains a multitude of its own possibilities for wellness, right? Perhaps I relapsed, but it was ever so slightly different. Perhaps I relapsed, but I didn't feel quite the same degree of shame or guilt. Perhaps I relapsed, but instead of wanting to hide and not tell my clinician about it, I decided to tell them about it, right? Each one of those could paradoxically make this relapse a success. Paradoxically.
Yes, 100%. That's the, when we relapse or struggle, that this is not some defining characteristic of our journey. It is an experience to take away from and learn from, and it might be different from the past experience in that you are struggling with experience. You're struggling with this lesson that you've learned from that struggle, or what have you, or understanding why, really non-judgmentally looking at that and thinking about, well, why did that happen? And that's, again, another just piece of the puzzle to learning about your recovery.
Completely. This is such an interesting time during the virus. We're all sheltering in place, and so I'm hearing time after time, oh, I'm noticing more emotional eating. I'm noticing, times that feel bingey, right? And one of my own personal reflections was like, well, yeah, the other day there I was getting and realizing, oh, I'm not even thinking right now. I'm on autopilot, right? And then I consumed them. And then I thought, oh, you sweet little babe. Yeah, this pandemic stuff is hard. Wasn't that delicious? Right? It wasn't the doing that defines my recovery. It was the how.
Right. And the intentions behind these things. And that's something that, that's something we talk about all the time with your relationship with food and your relationship with the body and movement, and working toward a healthy relationship with these things. People will ask me, Jamie, is this okay to have? Is this okay to do? And I cannot look at that food at all. And I cannot look at that movement at all, because that's not going to tell me anything. It's what's coming up for them when they are doing that, because that's very definitive of recovery, and if it's a recovery behavior.
Right. Oh God, brilliant. Yeah, exactly right.
So a couple other things as you were talking that I jotted down is, so you were talking about tracking one symptom. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Kind of chat a little bit more about that. So more specifically, what other things were happening on that timeline? Like, so for people who are viewing this, like, I just want to stop restricting, I just want to stop purging. Okay, so that is what happened on the timeline. You slowly stopped that behavior, or decreased that behavior. But what else was happening? So that for people who are in that beginning or middle or wherever they are on that journey, but they see a lot of they're in it. What else were you gaining during that time that led to the decrease of that symptom?
Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. I mean, there are kind of two ways I can go about this, which is to list like a bunch of symptoms. There's a great paper by McGilly and Zabluski that talks about like the necessary ingredients to recovery. And that's really rich and helpful. But maybe it would be more helpful for me to talk about it through my own personal experience, which was I think that during that period, I was doing a lot of interpersonal sort of attachment work. I didn't have the name for it at the time, right? But I was learning how to trust being safe in a relationship, right? Not just with a significant other, but in friendships. Um, I was addressing my mood disorders, right? I was seeing a psychiatrist to take a look at what was probably um, a lifetime of undiagnosed depression, and addressing that piece, you know. Um, I was still learning so much about agency,
Mhm.
right? About how to,
Yourself, I'm
yeah,
sure.
yeah. Still learning so much about myself. Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, but just a
some
few pieces of many.
right, and that's the complexity of recovery, and that's why, behaviors don't. Although, again, to reiterate what you said, Sarah, of course behaviors are super important to address and for safety, and something we would, to address what level of care. However, while also holding that, it's also very important to note what we are noting, that is not everything, and we can't getting stuck on that. It can be harmful. So, the other things, of some things that you mentioned in your video, were that what's included with like those non those markers that are maybe a less, you can't measure as much. Trying to lacking a better word for that, you can't really measure it, but that how, like, so addressing trauma, boundaries, distress tolerance, and learning about that, self-care, self-esteem, your like rituals with eating, or your ideas behind eating. And that's, as with the dietitian role, like really going into your choices behind those things, and where are you still having those rules. We might be, eating enough, but where is your freedom still being taken by these rules, or by the eating disorder. So all of these other things that go into it, that were happening on that timeline. And if you charted that, I think that would have been fantastic. If you could have made a chart of the things you were learning about
Incredible.
yourself in therapy, or in life,
Yes.
or the experiences you've had, and map that out through the whole 3 years.
Yes. Yes, Jamie. And that goes both ways, right? Like if you look at this, let's say this is my single symptom that I tracked, right? And then it ends. Woo, throw a party. It ended in 2008, Um, there are going to be some, if we were to have been able to track, using my voice, speaking kindly to myself, right, et cetera, setting boundaries, some of those things would have shown great improvements before that threshold. But I also want to stress for folks watching who are really feeling like they're stuck in the struggle of it after this moment, on the one hand, woohoo, celebration emoji. And on the other hand, there were other symptoms that were, of course, I was still struggling with for a long time after that, right? Like, body checking, right? Other more subtle, invisible behaviors that aren't necessarily listed in the DSM, but they were causing me, I mean, so much pain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And they took a lot longer.
Yep. Yep. I think that's super important to note, and talk about, just this, you're valid. So people who are watching this, that you're valid in your struggle, even if you don't have these certain behaviors. If you feel trapped by your relationship with food and body, that is valid. And that's something that you deserve to work through, because that still takes so much from us. So if someone watching who might be a chronic dieter, or whatever, not to label it, but anything that's causing you distress, that's still valid, and that still takes away from how you want to experience your life. And that's personally for me in my journey. I recovered a long time ago without really realizing that, oh, that was a significant eating disorder. But being in that disordered world for so long, that still took so much, and that's still valid in something to look at, and something you don't deserve. So I think that's really important. And to kind of chat a little bit. Just, we can keep chatting for hours, but there's a couple things I wanted to ask you about. And the first thing is this hopelessness in recovery. No, the eating disorder voice comes up a lot in saying, full recovery is not possible. That's not possible for you. Can you talk a little to that hopelessness?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The first thing that came to mind, so my degree is in mindfulness-based mental health counseling. And that was a really important piece for me, because this philosophical tenet of Buddhism that says there will always be suffering feels like kind of an important piece to bring in, right?
Mm-hmm.
In answer to this question, right? Like, yes, that eating disorder voice is going to come in and say, you are still struggling in some way. This is hopeless.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know where that leads, right? Where that would lead anyone, right? Which is to crumble and to not continue to uplift and thrive. And it's the uplifting and the thriving that actually slowly moves your beads toward recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So can we completely dismantle that notion of struggling being a harbinger of doom,
Mm-hmm.
and instead say, oh, well, I'm struggling right now. Yeah, that's actually a really human thing. And that's going to keep happening,
Mm-hmm.
because lucky me, I'm alive.
Mm-hmm.
So how interesting that I'm dealing with the suffering with these behaviors, right? I have some agency and choice, even when it doesn't feel like it, over how I want to deal with that suffering. And honestly, even just pausing and saying, wait, there's nothing wrong with me because I'm suffering, actually, I think may do the magic of like breaking that hopelessness downward spiral. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think what I'm hearing is just I guess you're learning about your suffering, you're understanding your suffering, and you're holding compassion for it, rather than, again, going back to that black and white thinking, but just kind of observing that part, or observing that piece. And it's, yeah, so that's what I took from it.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a reason, I do a lot of parts work, which now it's occurring to me, of course, makes sense, because we're talking about multiplicity in dimensions of recovery, but we are also a multiplicity of persons, right? And a lot of it does come down to like, how are we holding ourselves? How are these parts of ourselves treating these parts of ourselves, right? Are we saying, you're not doing a good job, you're hopeless, which is creating so much intrapsychic conflict? Or are we saying, oh, honey, are we being that good enough parent to ourselves? Oh, honey, you're really struggling right now. It's okay. That's very normal. That's very human. Let me hold you for a while, as a way to actually break the spiral of hopelessness.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Sarah. Yeah, I think parts work. I love parts work. As a dietitian, we do very surfacey parts work of just kind of understanding like the parts show up in your behaviors, and restricting as a part is the manager, and then and binging as the firefighter. And again, working for you, all parts working for you. And I think self-compassion is coming up a lot in this and in your voice, and I think that's really important to do, is to look at these parts, look at these behaviors, and hold some compassion for them as you learn to understand them.
Yeah. And you know what? I think compassion is something that happens naturally as soon as you break the black and white paradigm, right? all I do, my clients are so sick of me holding hands like this all day long, right? I say, well, this and this all day
Mm-hmm.
long. And there's something about that when we can hold two opposing truths,
Mm-hmm.
right? That demands compassion,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it demands a softening toward, any sort of dogmatic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's beautiful. And Jamie, for those of you watching who maybe don't know, Jamie was using language from a kind of therapy called internal family systems. The manager parts, the firefighter parts, who are the exiled parts of you that are shamed away, they're too dangerous to feel, you know. Um, and so I encourage folks to look into it because it's such a beautiful way of working.
Yeah, and I think it's just really important for eating disorder work, or for, just if I just think it's really important to address, because just as clinicians too, with our clients who come to us with this very complex behaviors, I think it's really hard to. We know what to do we know in recovery what we want to do. We want to get rid of those behaviors. And I wish it were that simple, but I think that compassion is the way out, always. And I think so that's something that you have to be able to address it in that way without. And I think again it just goes very much against the parts work, really is opposite of this black and white thinking of it's very gray, and we have to understand the gray. Yeah.
Ugh, and it's excruciating. We know it. Like for those of you watching that are like, just give me an answer.
Yeah.
Being in the gray is excruciating, and there's a lot of yummy healing there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think, like people watching in recovery will look back and see how how that gray is so essential. And I've heard this quote from and I want to give credit to it in the comments, but it was struggle in the right direction. Just because when we're in the gray, we feel like it's going to be a struggle and it's going to be uncomfortable, and that's also okay. And we just have to think about, well, are we struggling in the right direction? Are we struggling in toward recovery? Are we struggling by choosing the eating disorder? And it's okay if those again happen at this, at the same time. But going back to that hope of, just as you're doing that, just, and why I was so excited to chat with you is that, while we are in that gray, that to hold that hope of recovery, of full recovery, so that you keep going, and to know that timeline is going to look different for everyone, and it's super super messy. That graph of, recovery starts like this in our eating disorder, and then it's all over the place, and then we're out of that eating disorder. But when that way out is there for people.
Totally.
So yes, anyways, I guess we can wrap it up right there. It's such good conversation. So
I
thank you
know.
so much for having this conversation. I feel like we didn't do it justice. There's so many things we can chat about in here, but I think it's I'm really excited for people to hear this, and I know they'll hear the hope in your voice, and that you have so much, you so much insight that I think people will take away from this. So thank you so much for doing this, and I hope we can have another conversation like this again.
I would love to. I feel like, yeah, we just scratched the surface,
Mhm.
and there's also a lot to be said here for what happens when we bring in a feminist or a social justice lens, and really
Yeah,
start to locate the problem outside of you.
right.
um,
That's
yeah.
great. Yeah. And Sarah, that's great. I would love to, so just starting this YouTube channel, that is something that's huge. And also I'm like, okay, am I the person to speak to this? Right. Like, I don't know if you feel that way as a clinician, but,
Yep.
So I'm trying to think about how to go about that, but I think it's a really important conversation to be had, and I also think it's a missing piece in people's recovery. So I think it would be very essential to talk about it, to talk about the social justice issues here, and some of those things in our world, so happening out,
Totally,
recovering
totally.
in a disordered world. So I think that's recovering in a disordered world. Maybe that's our next topic.
Woo! I like that
It's a
one.
big one, but
Yeah. And thank you so much for your thoughtfulness. And all of the good work you're doing. It feels really wonderful. I feel really honored to be able to talk a little bit about my sliver of all of this, which is by its very nature limited. And yeah, just really wanting to name that. But I hope that any morsel of it can be of benefit.
yes, I'm sure it will be. And yeah, I'm just happy to do it. I love that. I'm just like you. I'm sure you can talk about this all day, because it just brings us a lot of joy as well to put that out there and to have this conversation.
Yeah.
So thanks so much, Sarah, for being here, and we'll chat with you soon.
Okay, Jamie, thanks. Bye, everyone.